You are welcome once again. I'll take you through study session 7, which will discuss epidemiological measurements. Sit down and relax to enjoy the lecture. Moving to the introduction, a principal role of epidemiology is to describe and explain differences in the distribution of diseases or other health outcomes of interest between populations. The essence is to measure disease occurrence and make comparisons between population groups. At the end of the study session, you should be able to discuss at least 3 epidemiological measures of disease frequency. You should be able to highlight and discuss various measures of effect in epidemiology. You should be able to explain measurement errors and bias. Measures of disease frequency. There are several means by which the occurrence of disease may be measured. The commonly used measures of incidence and prevalence can be distinguished by differences in the time of disease onset. Incidence is the count of new cases of the disease or outcome, while prevalence, on the other hand, counts both new and existing cases of the disease. Measures of disease frequency are used to describe how common an illness or other health event is, with reference to the size of the population at risk, and a measure of time. Prevalence is a useful measure for quantifying the burden of disease in a population at a given point in time. Apart from age, several factors determine prevalence. In particular, the severity of illness. If many people who develop a disease die within a short time, its prevalence is decreased. Also, the duration of illness, that is, if a disease lasts a short time, its prevalence is lower than if it lasts a long time. Also, the number of new cases. If many develop a disease, its prevalence is higher than if few people do so. Let's look at the relationship between prevalence and incidence. The proportion of the population that has a disease at a point in time and the rate of occurrence of new diseases during a period of time are closely related. Prevalence depends on the incidence rate and the duration of disease, and the relationship between incidence and prevalence can be expressed by prevalence is equals to incidence rate times the average duration of the disease. That is, P is equals to ID, as you can see on your screen, where P is the prevalence, I is the incidence rate, and D is the average duration of the disease. Let's look at other epidemiologic measures. We can have age or sex specific mortality rate, which is the number of deaths in a year in a specific age or sex group, divided by the mid-year population of age or sex group times 1000. We can have birth rate, we can have fertility rate, we can have infant mortality rate, you can calculate the perinatal mortality rate, you can calculate the neonatal mortality rate, the case fatality rate, and also the proportional mortality rate due to the time. Measures of effect. Measures of effect are used in epidemiological studies to assess the strength of an association between a putative risk factor and the subsequent occurrence of disease. This requires that the incidence of a disease in a group of persons exposed to a potential risk factor is compared with the incidence in a group of persons not exposed to the potential risk factors. These measures are often collectively referred to as measures of relative risk. The relative risk is a measure of the strength of an association between an exposure and disease and can be used to assess whether a valid observed association is likely to be causal. 3 measures of effect are the risk ratio, which is calculated as the risk in exposed group divided by the risk in unexposed group. We can have the rate ratio too, which is calculated as the incidence rate in exposed group divided by incidence rate in unexposed group. We can have odds ratio, which is calculated as odds of disease in exposed group divided by odds of disease in unexposed group. How to interpret measures of relative risk. A relative risk of 1.0 indicates that the incidence of that disease in the exposed and unexposed group is identical and that there is no association between the disease or risk factor or exposure. And when the relative risk is greater than 1, it means that the risk of disease is greater among those exposed and indicates a positive association of an increased risk among those exposed to the risk factor compared with those unexposed. When we have a relative risk of 1.3, it means a 30% rise in risk for those exposed to the risk factor compared to those who were unexposed. Let's look at the outcomes of epidemiology. Typically, outcomes for an epidemiologic study are as follows. It can be death, it can be disease or illness, it can be discomfort, it can be disability, it can be dissatisfaction, and it can be destitution. The first two, that is death and disease, are the most commonly used outcome. Measurement errors and bias. Bias cannot usually be totally eliminated from epidemiological studies. The aim, therefore, must be to keep it to a minimum, to identify those biases that cannot be avoided, to assess their potential impact, and to take this into account when interpreting results. The motto of an epidemiologist could be dirty hands but a clean mind. Among the measurement errors we have is selection bias, which occurs when the subjects studied are not representative of the target population about which conclusions are to be drawn. We can have information bias too, and we can have measurement bias. Thank you for listening. See you in the next study session. Bye for now.